This HOA, Karen, stormed into my lake cabin and told me to pack my bags over a fake $20 fine. She barged in. No knock, just pure rage, waving a stack of forged papers in my face. She screamed that I had 24 hours to pay up, or be forced out of the home I built with my own hands after 40 years as a firefighter. But as she stood there, gloating, she had no idea about the one tiny mistake on her official notice, a fatal flaw that was about to unravel her entire scam and send her straight to jail. What do you do when the person trying to destroy your life hands you the very evidence you need to ruin theirs? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, because the one phone call I made next ended everything. Saturday morning. It was exactly 9:12 a.m. I know the time because I had just finished my first pot of coffee and was out on the porch stacking firewood. The air was crisp, smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and the only sound was the rhythmic thud of split oak hitting the pile. For a man of 72, this was my idea of a perfect morning. It was quiet. It was steady. This little cabin on the lake wasn't just a house, it was the place my wife and I had planned to grow old in. 5 years after her passing, it was my sanctuary, the last piece of true peace I had left in this world. That peace was shattered by a pounding at my front door. It wasn't a knock. A knock is a request. This was a demand, like a police raid. Heavy, frantic thuds that vibrated through the floorboards. I put down the log I was holding, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked to the door, my old firefighter instincts kicking in. You don't pound on a door like that unless there's an emergency. But when I opened it, I didn't see fire or paramedics. I saw Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, her face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. She didn't wait for an invitation. She shoved past me, right into my living room, waving a thick stack of papers clutched in her hand like a weapon. She smelled of cheap perfume and burned coffee, a combination that always seemed to follow her. "Frank," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We're done with the warnings. This is it." She slammed the papers down on my coffee table, scattering them. At the top of the first page, in big, bold letters, were the words, "Final Notice of Violation." Underneath it, an amount was circled in red ink, $20. $20,000. I looked at her, then down at the papers. I'd lived in this cabin for 25 years. I paid my taxes on time. I kept my property neat and tidy. The only other time the HOA had contacted me was 3 years ago, to remind me to trim a tree branch that was hanging over the fence. A $20,000 fine was not just wrong, it was impossible. I picked up the top sheet. It was a long list of supposed violations. "Your dock is not compliant with Section 8, subsection C," she began to read, pointing a bony finger at the page. "It uses unapproved lumber. The dock was built by my father-in-law 40 years ago, from cedar that would outlast us all. It was there before the HOA even existed. Your roof is painted the wrong shade of brown," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "It's chestnut brown, not the approved sable brown. Clear violation. The roof was the same color it had been for a decade. Nobody had ever said a word. And this," she said, tapping the paper with a long, manicured nail, "is the most serious one. Your mailbox light is illegal. It constitutes a public nuisance and a safety hazard. My mailbox light was a single, low-wattage solar bulb that my granddaughter had given me for Christmas. It barely gave off enough light to find the keyhole at night. I just stood there, watching her. I'd seen people lose control in burning buildings, seen them panic in car wrecks. Her performance was something else entirely. It wasn't panic, it was a show. A power trip. After she finished her list of imaginary crimes, she looked me dead in the eye, a cruel little smirk playing on her lips. She delivered the line she had clearly been rehearsing all morning. "So here's what's going to happen. You have 24 hours to pay the full amount. If you don't, we will place a lien on this property and begin foreclosure proceedings. Frankly, I don't expect you to pay. So, I'll make it simple for you. Pack your bags, you're out." I stared at her, letting the words hang in the air. For a retired firefighter who spent a career running toward chaos, I'm not easily shaken. But the sheer audacity of it, the absolute venom behind her words, it stunned me. My home, the place where I'd raised my kids, where I'd held my wife's hand as she took her last breath. And this woman, this petty tyrant with a clipboard, was telling me to leave it. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. In a fire, you don't fight heat with heat. You cool it down. You find the source. So I did the one thing she wasn't expecting. I stayed calm. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, "that's a very serious accusation and a very large sum of money. I'm going to need to see the official documentation for these violations. Board meeting minutes where these fines were approved, copies of the notices you supposedly sent, the bylaws that state these, are even rules." For a split second, her smirk faltered. She had expected me to yell, to argue, to fall apart. She didn't expect a calm request for a paper trail. But she recovered quickly. "We already mailed it all to you," she sneered. "Weeks ago. It's not my fault if you don't check your mail." She gestured to the papers on the table. "This is your final notice. That's all you're getting." But I was already looking closer at the documents she'd brought. And that's when I saw it. It was small, but it was everything. I've handled thousands of official reports in my career: county permits, fire marshal inspections, state-issued certificates. They all have a certain look, a certain feel. The paper she'd slammed down felt cheap, like something you'd buy at a dollar store. The letterhead at the top, with the HOA's name, was slightly pixelated, fuzzy, like someone had copied a low-quality image off a website and pasted it into a Word document. Then I saw the state seal in the top right corner. It was supposed to add a layer of authority, to make the document look official and scary. But it was wrong. Our state seal has an eagle, and its head is supposed to be turned to the left, toward the olive branch of peace. On her document, the eagle's head was turned to the right, toward the arrows of war. It was a common mistake, one people made when they grabbed the first image they found on the internet, without checking the source. It was a fake. I looked down the page. The font size changed 3 times in a single paragraph. The margins were crooked. There were 2 different signatures from the compliance committee, but they were clearly signed by the same hand. This wasn't an official notice. This wasn't even a well-made forgery. It was a sloppy, arrogant scam. And in that moment, the shock wore off, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't about a dock, or a roof, or a tiny light on my mailbox. This was a shakedown. Karen Whitmore hadn't just stormed into my home to bully me. She had come here to commit a crime. And she'd just handed me all the evidence I would ever need. After Karen left, the silence she left behind was louder than her shouting. The papers were still scattered on my coffee table, a pile of cheap lies poisoning the air in my quiet cabin. I stood there for a long time, just looking at them. This place, this small cabin by the lake, was more than just wood and nails. Mary and I bought it the year I retired from the fire department. We'd saved for decades, planning a life where the loudest sound was the loons calling across the water at dawn. After she passed, every corner of this house held a memory. The worn spot on the armchair was where she read her books. The scratches on the floor were from the puppy our kids brought over one Christmas. This cabin was my history, my peace, my last connection to the life we built together. For someone to barge in and try to tear that away with a forged document wasn't just an insult. It was like trying to burn down a library of my life. The HOA had always been a nuisance, of course. Little notes left on the door about the grass being a half-inch too long, Or a passive-aggressive email about leaving your trash cans out for an hour too long after pickup. It was petty, but it was manageable. It was never this. This was a storm. Sudden and violent. Karen had only been president for about a year, and in that time, the tone had shifted from annoying to aggressive. But barging into homes and threatening foreclosure, this was new. This was war. I left the forged papers on the table and walked over to the old metal filing cabinet in the corner of my study. It's a habit you never lose from the fire service. Document everything. Every call, every inspection, every piece of equipment checked out and checked back in. Your logbook is your best witness, because paper never forgets. I pulled open the drawer labeled Property. Inside were 25 years of meticulously organized files. I found the receipt for our property taxes from last year, paid in full, with the official embossed stamp from the county treasurer's office. I pulled out the original building permit for the dock, dated 1982, signed by a county inspector who had probably been retired for 20 years. I even found the sales slip for the roof shingles we'd had installed a decade ago, with the color explicitly listed, sable brown. Every single one of Karen's accusations was a lie, and I had the paperwork to prove it. For a moment, a wave of relief washed over me. I had proof. But proof only matters if you can get someone to listen. At exactly 11:30 a.m., I picked up the phone and dialed the county clerk's office. A friendly-sounding woman named Carol answered. I kept my voice calm and polite. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Frank Dalton. Property at 123 Lakeview Lane. I'm just doing my due diligence and was hoping you could confirm if there are any outstanding fines or code violations on my property." I could hear her typing on her keyboard. Dalton. Dalton. Okay, got it right here. 123 Lakeview Lane. She paused for a moment. Nope, you're clean as a whistle, Mr. Dalton. Taxes are paid up. No complaints. No violations on file. Looks like you're a model citizen. I thanked her and hung up the phone. For the second time that day, I thought, maybe this is all just a huge, idiotic mistake. Maybe Karen had mixed me up with someone else. Maybe she printed the wrong address on her fake papers. Hope is a stubborn thing. You want to believe that people are just incompetent, not malicious. It's an easier world to live in. So I decided to let it rest for a bit. I went back outside to finish stacking my firewood, letting the familiar work calm my nerves. The sun was higher now, warming my back. The quiet had returned. And then, at just around 2:00 p.m., I heard her voice again. It carried across the yards from my neighbor Ed's place, 2 houses down. Karen was standing on his porch, clipboard in hand, speaking loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. I stopped what I was doing and listened. "I just don't know what to do about Frank," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "He's a freeloader, hasn't paid a dime in years. He owes the community $20,000, and that's just what we've found so far. The fines are going up every single day he refuses to pay." My blood ran cold. The word freeloader hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd worked my entire life, paid my taxes, served my community, and buried my own wife. And she was standing there, in front of my neighbors, painting me as some kind of deadbeat, a thief, stealing from the very community I loved. She wasn't just misinformed. She wasn't making a mistake. This was a calculated attack on my character. She was turning my neighbors against me, isolating me, building a public case based on absolute lies. The forged documents weren't just a threat meant for my eyes only. They were her weapon, and she was already using them to poison the well. In that moment, watching her from my porch, I understood everything. Nothing about this fight was going to be private. This wasn't a disagreement to be solved with a polite phone call or a clear set of receipts. She wanted me gone, and she was willing to lie, to forge, and to destroy my name to make it happen. My quiet cabin wasn't just my home anymore. It was the front line. That Monday morning marked the beginning of week 1. The fight was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a job. I was retired from the fire department, but you never retire from the habits that keep you alive. And the most important habit is this: you document everything. At the fire station, we had a logbook. Every call, every drill, every check of the oxygen tanks, it all went into the log. The time, the date, the details, the names. That logbook was our shield. It proved we did our job right. So, the first thing I did Monday morning was buy a brand new spiral-bound notebook and a pack of pens. At the top of the first page, I wrote in neat block letters, HOA, Incident Log, Frank Dalton. My first entry was Saturday, 9/12, AIM, detailing Karen's unauthorized entry, her exact words, and the condition of the documents she left behind. This logbook was now my full-time job. I started carrying my phone with me everywhere. Not for calls, but for its camera. On Tuesday afternoon, around 3:00 p.m., I was in my kitchen when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was Karen. She was standing at the edge of my property, right by the tree line, half hidden behind a large pine. She was just staring at my cabin. She thought she was being sneaky, but she stood out like a sore thumb. I raised my phone, zoomed in, and took a clear photograph. The timestamp was automatically embedded. Tuesday, 3:02 p.m. I saved it to a new folder on my computer called Evidence. The next day, she did it again. This time walking right up to my dock and pointing at it, as if she were showing it to an invisible jury. I got another picture. By the end of the week, I had a small collection of photos showing her trespassing on my property, day after day. The emails started coming too. They were addressed to the entire neighborhood email list. The subject line of the first one was, "Important update regarding community compliance." In it, she talked vaguely about a long-time resident who was refusing to cooperate and putting the entire community at financial risk. She didn't use my name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. I took a screenshot of the entire email, making sure to include the header with the date and time it was sent. I saved it as a PDF in my evidence folder. 2 days later, another one came. This one was more aggressive. Failure to pay will result in legal action. It was a masterclass in passive aggression and empty threats. But mixed in with her ranting was something incredibly useful. Attached to the email was a digital copy of the violation notice. I downloaded it immediately. When I opened the file, I saw it was mostly the same as the one she had thrown on my coffee table. But something was off. I printed it out and laid it next to the first one. That's when I saw it. The due date was different. The paper version she gave me just said the fine was due immediately. The digital version attached to her email had a specific due date, the end of the month. A small detail, but a crucial one. A real legal notice doesn't have floating due dates. The third version came from the most unlikely source. Linda Perez, one of the board members, lived 3 doors down. She's a quiet woman, a bookkeeper who always seemed terrified of Karen at the board meetings. On Friday morning, she was walking her little dog and stopped by my mailbox. I was on the porch, reading the paper. She gave me a nervous little wave. "Oh, Frank," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think I got some of your mail by mistake." She handed me an envelope. It was addressed to her, but inside was another copy of the violation notice. It looked like the one Karen had sent to the board to get them on her side. Linda gave me a quick, meaningful look, then hurried off down the street without another word. She never broke her stride. She had given me proof, but she had done it in a way she could deny if Karen ever asked. I took the new document inside and laid it out on my kitchen table next to the other 2. 3 documents, all claiming to be the same official notice for a $20 fine. But side by side, they were a disaster. Version 1. The one she hand-delivered. Due immediately. Total fine. $20. Version 2. From the email attachment. Due by the 30th. Total fine. $20. But the signature at the bottom was in a different, messier font. Version 3. The one Linda gave me. Due in 15 days. Total fine. Listed as $19,500. I stared at them. Which one was the real fine? Which deadline was the real deadline? The answer was simple. None of them. This was proof of a scam in progress. She couldn't even keep her own lies straight. I took a black marker and circled every single discrepancy on all 3 pages. The different dates, the different amounts, the different fonts, the different signatures. By the time I was done, the papers were covered in black ink. That evening, I got a voicemail. It was Karen. Her voice was no longer pretending to be concerned. It was cold, flat, and full of menace. "Frank," the message began, "I see you're still here. That's a mistake. This is your final warning. I am filing the lien against your cabin on Monday morning. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. You should have just packed your bags." I saved the voicemail. Another entry for the log. The threat was now direct, and the timeline was clear. She was done with the games. She was coming for my home, and I had my 3 pieces of paper laid out on my table, ready for her. The 3rd week arrived with a notice taped to my front door. It wasn't another fine. It was an invitation. A mandatory HOA meeting at the community clubhouse, Wednesday evening at 7:00 p.m. The agenda was listed in a single ominous bullet point. Discussion and vote on non-compliant property at 123 Lakeview Lane. She wasn't just coming after me anymore. She was trying to turn my neighbors into her mob. The clubhouse was a small, sterile room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow on the 24 or so residents sitting in mismatched folding chairs. People were quiet, avoiding eye contact. You could feel the tension in the air, thick and uncomfortable. I saw Linda Perez in the back row, staring intently at her folded hands. Karen was at the front, standing behind a flimsy plastic table with 2 other board members. She looked triumphant, like a general about to win a battle she had started for no reason. I took a seat in the front row, right in her line of sight. I had a single manila folder on my lap. Nothing more. Karen called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her knuckles on the table. She skipped all the usual formalities and launched right into her attack. "As you all know," she began, her voice ringing with false authority, "we have a serious issue of non-compliance in our community. A resident, Mr. Frank Dalton, has accrued over $20,000 in fines for repeated and flagrant violations." She held up a copy of her forged notice, the one with the pixelated letterhead, waving it for everyone to see. "These are serious violations that affect everyone's property values. An unapproved dock, an illegal paint color, a hazardous mailbox light." She went on for 5 minutes, painting a picture of me as a menace, a freeloader who was dragging the entire neighborhood down. When she finished, she looked directly at me. "The board has voted to move forward with placing a lien on the property, but we wanted to give Mr. Dalton one last chance to speak before we make it official." The room was silent. Every eye was on me. I stood up slowly, clutching my manila folder. I walked to the front of the room and stood beside the table, but I didn't look at Karen. I turned and faced my neighbors. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice calm and even. "My name is Frank Dalton. I've lived here for 25 years. I opened my folder. The first thing I pulled out was a single sheet of paper. "This morning, I called the county clerk's office," I said, holding it up. "I asked them if my property had any fines or violations on file. This is a printout of the official record. It shows my property is in good standing, with 0 complaints, and all taxes paid in full. I placed the paper on the table for everyone to see. A few people in the front row leaned forward to read it. Next, I pulled out my file of receipts. The old, crinkled building permit for the dock from 1982, the receipt for the roof shingles, with the color sable brown clearly listed, the county tax receipt, with its official embossed stamp. I laid them out one by one, a neat row of facts. These are my records, I said simply. They show I've done everything by the book. Then, I reached into the folder for my final exhibit, the 3 different violation notices. I had them clipped together. I walked over to the table and laid them out, side by side, right in front of Karen's stack of papers. And these, I said, my voice dropping a little, are the documents the HOA has provided. I pointed to each one. This is the notice Karen gave me, which says the fine is due immediately. This is the one she attached to a neighborhood email, which gives a due date of the 30th. And this is the one a board member received, which lists a different fine amount entirely and says it's due in 15 days. I paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with my neighbors. I could see the confusion on their faces turning into understanding. The murmuring started, a low buzz that grew louder. A legal notice doesn't have 3 different due dates, I said, keeping my voice steady. A legal notice doesn't have 2 different fine amounts. These aren't notices, they're forgeries. I looked at the board members, then at the audience. And I said the words that had been in my head all week. You can't vote against gravity, and you can't vote against receipts. Facts are not a democracy. These papers are lies. The room shifted. The tide had turned. People were no longer looking at me like I was a problem. They were looking at Karen like she was a criminal. The other 2 board members looked pale, shrinking in their seats. Linda Perez was finally looking up, her eyes wide. Karen saw she was losing control. Her face, which had been so smug and confident, was now a tight, red knot of fury. She shot to her feet, knocking her chair over. "He's lying," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's manipulating evidence. He forged those papers to make me look bad. He is the one breaking the law." But no one was buying it. Her desperation was plain to see. The louder she yelled, the more guilty she looked. The crowd wasn't with her anymore. She had lost the room. She knew it. With a final, strangled cry of frustration, she grabbed her papers from the table, shoved them into her bag, and stormed toward the exit. But she stopped at the door. She turned back, her eyes burning with hate. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you're so smart with your little receipts? Fine, I'll just get the county sheriff involved. We'll see how you handle a real investigation." And with that, she wrenched the door open and slammed it shut behind her, leaving the rest of us in a stunned, ringing silence. I didn't have to wait long. Week 5 rolled around, and sure enough, on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10:15 a.m., a county sheriff's patrol car pulled into my driveway. The flashing lights weren't on, but the sight of the official vehicle was enough to get the neighborhood curtains twitching. This was it. Karen had made good on her threat. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s stepped out of the car. His uniform was crisp, his face was weathered and serious, and his name tag read, Sheriff Reynolds. He walked up to my porch with a slow, deliberate pace. I was already waiting for him at the door. I didn't want him to have to knock. "Good morning, Sheriff," I said, keeping my voice low and respectful. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral. "I'm here about a complaint filed by a Ms. Karen Whitmore on behalf of the Homeowners Association. She's alleging some pretty serious code violations and failure to pay fines." He was holding a clipboard with a single sheet of paper on it. It was a copy of one of Karen's forgeries, the one with the pixelated letterhead. I didn't get defensive. I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded. I figured as much, I said. Would you like a cup of coffee, Sheriff? I've got a fresh pot on. He looked a little surprised. Most people he visited probably started shouting or making excuses. He hesitated for a second, then gave a slight nod. Coffee would be good. I led him into my kitchen and poured him a mug. I invited him to sit at the kitchen table, the same table where I had laid out all my evidence. My manila folder was sitting right there. As he sipped his coffee, I calmly laid out my side of the story. I didn't call Karen names or accuse her of being crazy. I just presented the facts. I showed him the printout from the county clerk showing no violations. I showed him the old permits and receipts. Then, I laid out the 3 different violation notices, all side by side, just like I had at the meeting. Sheriff Reynolds put his coffee down and leaned in, studying the papers. He was silent for a long time. He picked up one of Karen's notices, then another, holding them up to the light. He ran his thumb over the signatures at the bottom. Well, I'm no handwriting expert, he said, his voice a low rumble. But you don't need to be one to see that these signatures don't match the ones on your official county documents. He tapped the pixelated HOA logo with his finger. And this letterhead looks like something my grandson would make for a school project. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and direct. Mr. Dalton, this HOA has been a thorn in our side for about a year now. Constant calls over petty stuff. But this, he shook his head slowly, this is different. This looks an awful lot like fraud. He gathered up the copies of the forged notices. I'll be taking these with me, he said. We'll be having a chat with Miss Whitmore. He stood up, finished his coffee, and placed the empty mug in my sink. He thanked me for the coffee and left without another word. As I watched him drive away, a feeling of hope, real and solid, settled in my chest. The truth was finally in the hands of someone with the authority to do something about it. But my relief didn't last long. The very next morning, I woke up to find a giant, hideous sign hammered into my front lawn. It was made of cheap plywood, painted a garish, fire engine red. In sloppy white letters, it read, "Property in violation. Foreclosure pending." She had done it overnight, like a coward in the dark. It was a public shaming, a scarlet letter for my home. It was her last, desperate attempt to humiliate me and turn everyone against me. But it had the opposite effect. Later that afternoon, my neighbor Ed Molina stopped by. Ed's a retired civil engineer, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who spent 40 years designing bridges and buildings. He'd seen the sign. He walked right up to it, squinted, and shook his head in disgust. "Frank, this is getting ridiculous," he said. I invited him in, and we sat at the kitchen table. He'd heard about the meeting and had seen the sheriff's car. I showed him the 3 notices. Ed put on his reading glasses and studied them, not like a neighbor, but like an engineer reviewing a set of bad blueprints. He pointed to the list of violations. "Okay, let's break this down," he said. "The dock. She's citing a subsection C that doesn't exist in our county's building code. I checked it this morning. She just made it up." He moved on to the next one. The roof paint. HOAs can have rules about colors, that's true, but they can't enforce it retroactively on a roof that was painted 10 years before they even wrote the rule. That's called a grandfather clause. It's basic contract law. Then he got to the mailbox light, and he actually chuckled. And this is the best one. She's calling a 1-watt solar light a safety hazard. Frank, in engineering, a safety hazard has a specific definition. It means something poses an immediate risk of injury or property damage. That light couldn't pose a risk to a moth. He leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses. She's not just breaking the rules, Frank. She's inventing rules out of thin air and then pretending they're law. She's misusing safety codes to scare people. She can't enforce safety rules that don't exist. That's not how the law works. Hearing him break it down so simply, so logically, was like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't just my word against hers anymore. The sheriff had the forgeries. And now, a professional engineer had confirmed that her entire case was built on a foundation of pure fiction. The sign on my lawn was an ugly, desperate lie. And now, I had two very credible, very official ways to prove it. The final act began on a Friday morning, the start of week 6. The red sign was still on my lawn, a monument to Karen's arrogance. I had planned to take it down myself that afternoon, but she beat me to it. At exactly 9:00 a.m., her minivan screeched to a halt at the end of my driveway. She got out and marched up to my front door, not with a clipboard this time, but with a smug, triumphant look on her face. She was convinced she had won. I watched her from the living room window. This was it. I had been preparing for this moment. A few neighbors were already outside, alerted by the sound of her car. Ed was in his garden. Linda Perez was getting her mail. This wasn't going to be private, and that was exactly what I wanted. She started banging on my cabin door, the sound echoing across the quiet street. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic pounding from the first time. This was a slow, deliberate, intimidating rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. "Frank Dalton," she shouted, her voice laced with venom. "This is your final notice. The grace period is over. The sheriff is on my side. You have 1 hour to pack up, or you will be dragged out. Open this door!" I didn't open the door. I didn't shout back. The days of reacting were over. Today, I was acting. Instead of walking to the door, I walked to the kitchen counter, picked up my phone, and calmly dialed a number I now knew by heart. It was a direct line, one Sheriff Reynolds had given me after he'd opened an official investigation. As Karen continued to bang and shout, I put the call on speakerphone. The sound was loud enough to be heard clearly by anyone standing near the front of the house. The phone rang once, then a man's voice, calm and professional, answered. "State Attorney's Office, Fraud Division. Investigator Miller speaking." I looked out the window. The banging had stopped. Karen was standing there, frozen, her hand still raised in a fist. She had heard it. So had Ed and Linda. A few other neighbors were now drifting out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. They stood on their lawns, watching. This was her show, but I was about to change the script. "Hello, Investigator Miller," I said, my voice steady and clear. "This is Frank Dalton calling. I was given this number by Sheriff Reynolds. He asked me to call if there were any further developments. I have a case number for you." "Go ahead, Mr. Dalton," the investigator said, his voice all business. I read off the case number, the same one Sheriff Reynolds had assigned to the file containing Karen's forged documents. "Yes, I have it right here," Investigator Miller said, after a moment. His voice was now crystal clear, amplified by the speakerphone, broadcasting out my open living room window into the morning air. "The file on Ms. Karen Whitmore. Let me see the notes." "Yes. We've already confirmed with the county clerk that those fine notices are fraudulent. The signatures were forged, and the state seal was counterfeit. We also have a statement from the county engineer, confirming the building codes she cited are non-existent." From my window, I could see Karen's face. The smug triumph was gone, replaced by a ghastly pale white. The color drained from her cheeks as if someone had pulled a plug. Her mouth hung open slightly. The neighbors were now all standing still, like statues, their attention locked on my front porch. The investigator wasn't finished. "Actually, Mr. Dalton, your call is very timely. Based on the evidence you provided, a warrant was issued this morning for Ms. Whitmore's arrest on charges of forgery, harassment, and extortion. We're dispatching officers now. They should be there shortly." And then, in the distance, we all heard it. It was faint at first, a barely audible cry in the far-off morning quiet. But it was growing louder. Sirens. Not one, but two. They were getting closer with every passing second. Karen's head snapped up. She looked down the long road leading into our neighborhood, then back at my house, her eyes wide with panic and disbelief. The hunter had just realized she had walked into a trap. The game was over. The lie had run out of road. She had built her entire kingdom on a foundation of fake paper and loud words. And now, the real world, with its real laws and real consequences, was coming for her at 60 miles an hour. The sirens were screaming now, loud and undeniable, a sound that meant help for some and judgment for others. For me, after 6 long weeks, it was the sound of peace, returning to my quiet lake cabin. The 2 patrol cars turned onto our street and rolled to a stop right behind Karen's minivan, their red and blue lights flashing silently, painting the trees and houses in strokes of official authority. It was 10:02 a.m. Sheriff Reynolds stepped out of the first car. 2 younger deputies got out of the second. They didn't look at the crowd of neighbors or at the ridiculous sign on my lawn. Their focus was entirely on Karen, who was still standing on my porch like a trapped animal. She looked from the officers to me, then back again, her mind clearly racing for an escape that didn't exist. "Karen Whitmore?" Sheriff Reynolds asked, his voice calm but firm, carrying easily in the now silent morning air. She didn't answer. She just stared, her mouth slightly agape. "You are under arrest for felony forgery, extortion, and harassment," he continued, walking toward the porch steps. "You have the right to remain silent." The 2 deputies moved past him, walking with a purpose that was both professional and deeply final. One of them gently took Karen's arm and turned her around. The other produced a pair of handcuffs. The sound was sharp and clear, a single metallic click that seemed to echo across the entire neighborhood. Justice doesn't always have a loud, booming voice. Sometimes, it's just a quiet little click. They led her down the steps and to the back of the patrol car. She didn't resist. All the fight, all the righteous anger she had been projecting for 6 weeks, had vanished. She looked small and defeated. The deputies placed her in the back of the car, and a moment later it pulled away, its lights still flashing but its siren now silent. The second car, with Sheriff Reynolds, stayed behind. He walked over to me. I had finally come out onto my porch. The show was over. He nodded toward the departing car. "Took 1 minute on the phone," he said, a hint of a smile on his face. "But the paper trail, that took 6 weeks." He looked at the logbook I was still holding in my hand, then at the manila folder on my kitchen table, visible through the open doorway. "You did it right, Frank. You were steady. You documented everything. You kept it legal. That's what made the case. Most people just get angry and yell. You built a foundation." He tipped his hat to me, got back in his car, and drove away, leaving a quiet, stunned neighborhood behind. A few of my neighbors started to applaud, a quiet, respectful clap that was more about relief than celebration. Ed came over and slapped me on the back. Linda Perez gave me a tearful, thankful smile from her lawn. The ugly red sign on my property was taken down and tossed into the back of a neighbor's pickup truck within minutes. The aftermath was swift and total. With the president arrested for fraud, the entire HOA was placed under county review. The investigation revealed that Karen had been running the place like her own personal piggy bank, inventing fines and intimidating residents for years. My case was just the one that finally broke the dam. Within a week, the county issued an order dissolving our HOA entirely. The fraud had voided its authority. The petty tyrant was gone, and her kingdom crumbled into dust behind her. A few weeks later, checks started arriving in people's mailboxes. The county had managed to recover some of the money Karen had extorted over the year, and they were issuing refunds to every single resident who had been fined under her fake rules. This morning, I'm sitting on my dock, the same dock she claimed was non-compliant. The water is calm, reflecting the deep blue of the sky. The air smells of pine and clean water again. The peace is back. It's funny looking back on it all. Karen thought power came from shouting, from banging on doors and waving fake papers. She thought lies, if you told them loud enough and often enough, could replace the truth. She was wrong. Power, real power, doesn't come from volume. It comes from receipts. It comes from patience. It comes from a logbook filled with dates and times. It comes from knowing the rules better than the person trying to use them against you. And sometimes, it comes from one steady phone call, made at exactly the right time. That's why Karen is gone. And that's why my cabin is still standing.